Have you ever tried to get close to an avoidant, only to watch them slam the door in your face? You lean in, they step back. You get closer, they build walls. You offer love, they run. It's the most heartbreaking pattern with avoidant partners, and it reveals something crucial about how their minds work when intimacy becomes possible. When an avoidant closes the door on your attempts to get close, they're not rejecting you personally, they're protecting themselves from what feels like emotional danger. But why does their brain interpret your love as a threat? Why does your care feel like a trap? Why does your desire for closeness feel like something that could destroy them? The answer lies in how their emotional system learned to survive. For avoidants, emotional intimacy feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. The closer you get, the more likely they are to fall. But why do they see intimacy as a cliff instead of a bridge? What makes this even more painful is that avoidants often desperately want the very thing they're running from. They crave connection, but their entire emotional system is wired to treat closeness as danger. It's like being thirsty but afraid of water. The need is real, but so is the terror. But why would someone develop a fear of the very thing they need? The reason avoidants close the door stems from how their protective system developed. Most avoidants learned early that emotional needs were inconvenient, that vulnerability led to rejection, or that getting too close to people resulted in pain. But why did these early experiences create such a powerful door-closing response? Because their developing brain learned to associate intimacy with loss of safety. When you're young and someone dismisses your emotions, criticizes your needs, or withdraws love when you're vulnerable, your brain files this information as emotional closeness equals danger. The door slamming comes from survival strategies they developed when they were too young to understand that not everyone would hurt them. But why does this pattern persist into adulthood? Why don't they just learn that some people are safe? Because their nervous system doesn't distinguish between past and present threats. When you try to get close to an avoidant, their brain doesn't think this person is different. It activates the same protective response that kept them safe as children. These early lessons run so deep because they happened when avoidants were just kids. Why do childhood experiences have such lasting power? Because a child's mind is like wet cement. Every experience leaves a permanent mark. When that cement hardens into adulthood, changing those marks requires tremendous effort and completely different experiences. Many avoidants also learn that their emotional needs were burdens to others. But why would a child learn that their needs are burdensome? Often because their caregivers were overwhelmed, emotionally unavailable, or dealing with their own unresolved pain. When a parent consistently responds to emotional needs with frustration, exhaustion, or withdrawal, the child learns that needing emotional support is selfish and problematic. This is why avoidants often feel guilty for wanting closeness. But where does this guilt come from? It comes from years of being told, directly or indirectly, that their emotional needs were too much for others to handle. The avoidance relationship with time also plays a crucial role in why they close doors. But why does timing matter so much? Because many avoidants experienced emotional availability from caregivers as unpredictable and temporary. Love came and went without warning, affection was withdrawn suddenly, and emotional support disappeared when they needed it most. This taught them that emotional connections are inherently unstable and likely to end badly. When you try to create lasting intimacy with an avoidant, you're asking them to believe in something their experience has taught them doesn't exist. Permanent emotional safety. But why is this belief so hard to change? Because their entire survival strategy is built on the assumption that emotional connections are temporary and potentially dangerous. Believing in permanent safety would require dismantling the very system that has protected them their entire life. The physical environment also shaped how avoidants learned to close doors. Many grew up in homes where privacy was either non-existent or fiercely guarded, where boundaries were either completely absent or rigidly enforced. But why does this create door-closing behavior in relationships? Because they never learned healthy ways to manage emotional intimacy. They only learned complete openness or complete shutdown. This all-or-nothing approach to emotional intimacy explains why avoidants struggle with gradual vulnerability. But why can't they just open doors slowly? Because their nervous system was never trained for gradual exposure to emotional risk. They learned that emotional exposure was either completely safe or completely dangerous, with no middle ground. The concept of controlled vulnerability feels foreign and potentially more dangerous than complete protection. The concept of emotional debt also haunts many avoidants. But what is emotional debt and why does it make them close doors? Emotional debt is the feeling that accepting care, support, or love creates an obligation to give back at levels they might not be able to sustain. Many avoidants grew up in families where emotional support came with strings attached, where receiving care meant owing something in return that often felt impossible to repay. This creates a paradox where the more you try to give an avoidant, the more trapped they feel. But why would generosity feel like a trap? Because they learned that gifts of emotional support usually came with hidden costs, expectations for emotional return, demands for greater vulnerability, or pressure to meet the giver's emotional needs. Your kindness doesn't feel like love, it feels like accumulating debt they can't afford to pay. The avoidance relationship with emotional expression was often distorted in childhood. But why do they struggle to express feelings even when they want to? Because many learned that emotional expression was either ignored, criticized, or used against them later. They might have been told their feelings were wrong, too much, or inappropriate. They might have had their emotional expressions minimized, mocked, or turned into ammunition during family conflicts. This creates a situation where avoidants want to share their inner world, but literally don't know how to do it safely. But why don't they just learn these skills as adults? Because emotional expression feels like diffusing a bomb. One wrong move and everything explodes. They'd rather stay silent than risk saying something that triggers rejection, criticism, or abandonment. The concept of emotional privacy is also crucial for understanding why avoidants close doors. But why is emotional privacy so important to them? Because their inner emotional world might be the only thing that was truly theirs in childhood. If they grew up in families where everything else was scrutinized, controlled, or invaded, their private thoughts and feelings became their sanctuary. When you ask for emotional intimacy, you're asking to enter their sanctuary. But why would they protect this space so fiercely? Because it's where they go to feel safe, to process experiences without judgment, and to exist without having to manage anyone else's reactions. Opening this space to another person feels like giving up the one place where they have complete control. Many avoidants also struggle with emotional timing mismatches. But what does this mean, and why does it cause door closing? Emotional timing mismatches occur when your emotional needs and their emotional availability don't align. You might need reassurance when they need space, or want closeness when they need independence. These mismatches feel overwhelming to avoidants because they confirm their belief that relationships are fundamentally incompatible with their emotional rhythms. But why can't they just adjust their timing to match yours? Because their emotional availability is often tied to feeling safe and in control. When you need emotional connection at moments when they don't feel emotionally prepared, it triggers their fear of being overwhelmed or consumed. They close the door not because they don't care, but because the timing feels dangerous to their emotional balance. When you try to get close to an avoidant, you're asking them to disarm their most trusted defense mechanism. But why is this defense mechanism so trusted? Because it's never failed them. Distance has always kept them safe from emotional devastation. Closeness, in their experience, has led to hurt. Why would they choose the thing that historically caused pain over the thing that historically provided protection? The pathways in their brain have been carved deep through repetition. Why do these pathways become so entrenched? Because every time emotional closeness led to disappointment, every time vulnerability resulted in criticism, every time they opened their heart and got hurt, those pathways got stronger. Their brain became an expert at predicting emotional danger and avoiding it. The concept of emotional give and take is also foreign to many avoidants. But why don't they understand that relationships require mutual emotional investment? Because many grew up in families where emotional giving was one-sided. Either they were expected to meet everyone else's emotional needs while their own were ignored, or they learned that emotional needs were met through performance rather than authentic connection. This performance-based understanding of love explains why avoidants often retreat when relationships become effortless. But why would ease in a relationship feel threatening? Because they learned that love had to be earned through constant effort, compliance, or achievement. When you offer them unconditional love, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a trap, because they can't control or predict when it might be withdrawn. The timing of when avoidants close the door often seems random, but there's a specific reason why it happens when it does. They might be fine with surface-level connection, casual affection, or even physical intimacy. But the moment emotional vulnerability becomes expected or required, that's when the door slams shut. But why is emotional vulnerability specifically so triggering? Because emotional vulnerability is where they got hurt the most. Physical intimacy feels manageable. Bodies are predictable. Emotional intimacy feels terrifying because emotions are unpredictable. They can't control how you'll react to their feelings. They can't guarantee you won't use their vulnerabilities against them, and they can't protect themselves once their emotional walls are down. Many avoidants also struggle with something called emotional flooding. But why do emotions feel so overwhelming to them? Because they never learned healthy ways to process intense feelings. If your family handled emotions through denial, explosion, or complete shutdown, you never developed the internal tools needed to navigate emotional intensity. When feelings start rising, it doesn't feel like information, it feels like drowning. This is why avoidants have learned to love with one foot out the door. They can engage, connect, and even care deeply, but always with an escape route mapped out. But why do they need an escape route if they claim to want the relationship? Because wanting something and feeling safe with something are completely different experiences for avoidants. They might desperately want emotional closeness, but their nervous system still treats it as a survival threat. The escape route isn't about not caring. It's about maintaining the illusion of control in a situation that historically felt dangerous and unpredictable. The fear of losing control is particularly powerful for avoidants. But why is control so important to them? Because lack of control in their childhood often led to chaos, unpredictability, or emotional harm. Control became their way of preventing bad things from happening. When you ask them to be vulnerable, you're asking them to give up the very thing that has kept them feeling safe. Your attempts to reassure an avoidant that it's safe to get close often backfire. But why? Why would reassurance make them more likely to close the door instead of less likely? Because reassurance itself can feel like pressure. When you offer comfort and safety, their brain interprets this as an expectation to be vulnerable, which triggers their door-closing response even faster. But why would expectations feel threatening to an avoidant? Because expectations in their past often came with consequences. If they were expected to be emotionally available as children and failed to meet those expectations, they might have faced rejection, criticism, or withdrawal of love. Your expectation, even when well-intentioned, activates their fear of disappointing you and losing you. The door-closing mechanism in avoidance happens automatically because their nervous system has been conditioned to prioritize emotional safety over emotional connection. But why has their nervous system made this choice? Because in their experience, emotional connection consistently led to emotional injury. Their brain literally rewired itself to prefer loneliness over the risk of being hurt by someone they care about. Avoidants also often struggle with something called emotional permanence. But what does this mean, and why does it affect relationships? Just like children develop object permanence, understanding that things exist even when they can't see them, people need to develop emotional permanence, believing that love exists even during conflict or distance. Many avoidants never fully develop this capacity, so when you're upset with them, they genuinely believe the love has disappeared entirely. This explains why conflicts feel so threatening to avoidants. It's not just about the immediate disagreement. It's about their deep fear that your love for them has evaporated. But why would conflict feel like the end of love? Because in their childhood, parental love often did disappear during conflicts. They learned that love is conditional and temporary, something that exists only when things are going well. Many avoidants describe feeling suffocated when partners try to get too close. But why does love feel suffocating instead of nourishing? Because their experience of love often came with conditions, expectations, or demands that felt overwhelming. When you lean in emotionally, when you want to share feelings or discuss the relationship, their brain doesn't interpret this as intimacy. It interprets it as emotional work they're not equipped to handle. But why aren't they equipped to handle emotional intimacy? Because they never learned how. If your caregivers didn't model healthy emotional expression, if your family dismissed feelings as inconvenient, or if emotional conversations consistently led to conflict, you never developed the skills needed for emotional intimacy. It's not that they don't want to be emotionally intimate, they literally don't know how to do it safely. The cultural aspect also plays a role in why avoidants struggle with emotional closeness. Many avoidants grew up in families or cultures that valued independence, self-reliance, and emotional control above connection and vulnerability. But why do these cultural messages make intimacy harder? Because they create internal conflict. Part of them craves connection while another part believes that needing connection is weakness or immaturity. The harder you try to pry open the door an avoidant has closed, the more securely they lock it. But why does persistence make things worse instead of better? Because persistence confirms their deepest fear about relationships, that other people's emotional needs will eventually overwhelm their capacity to meet them. Your pursuit becomes evidence that they were right to close the door in the first place. For avoidants, emotional intimacy often feels like losing themselves in another person. But why would sharing emotions feel like losing yourself? Because many avoidants grew up in families where individual identity was either ignored or consumed by someone else's emotional needs. They learned that being close to someone meant disappearing into that person's world, losing their own voice, and having their own needs become invisible. This fear of being consumed explains why avoidants can seem to do complete personality changes when relationships get serious. But why would commitment trigger personality changes? Because commitment, in their experience, meant sacrificing parts of themselves to maintain the relationship. The person who was once engaging and present becomes distant and unavailable because they're protecting the core of who they are from what feels like emotional invasion. The door-closing behavior of avoidance gets triggered by specific emotional requests, but why are these requests so threatening? Conversations about feelings feel dangerous because they were criticized for having feelings. Discussions about the future feel overwhelming because commitment in their past often meant loss of freedom. Expectations for emotional availability feel impossible because they were punished for not being emotionally available enough in the past. When an avoidant closes the door, they're not just stepping away from you, they're stepping away from their own emotional experience. But why would someone disconnect from their own feelings? Because their feelings were often too painful to bear, too dangerous to express, or too inconvenient for others to tolerate. Disconnection became their way of surviving emotionally overwhelming situations. Many avoidants genuinely don't understand why their door-closing behavior is so devastating to their partners. But why don't they understand? Because in their families, emotional withdrawal was normal. They might have grown up thinking that space during conflict was healthy, that processing emotions privately was mature, or that taking time away from relationships was necessary for individual well-being. Avoidants often close the door when they feel like they're being figured out. But why is being understood so threatening? Because being understood, in their experience, often led to their vulnerabilities being used against them during conflicts. Knowledge about their emotional world became ammunition for others to hurt them more effectively. The door becomes protection against being known too deeply, because being known has historically been dangerous. When avoidants start to recover from door-closing patterns, they need to learn why emotional intimacy doesn't have to mean emotional overwhelm. They need to understand why opening the door doesn't have to mean losing control, and why being vulnerable doesn't automatically lead to being hurt. But why is this so difficult for them to learn? Because their nervous system has years of evidence that intimacy equals danger. Changing this belief requires not just intellectual understanding, but felt experiences of safety that contradict their historical data. They need to experience emotional intimacy that doesn't lead to criticism, vulnerability that doesn't result in rejection, and closeness that doesn't require sacrificing their individual identity. Understanding why avoidants close doors opens possibilities for different approaches to intimacy. When you understand that their withdrawal comes from terror rather than indifference, that their distance stems from past pain rather than current rejection, you can respond with compassion instead of pursuit. The reason most profound shifts happen when avoidants begin to trust someone is because trust, for them, means believing that this person won't use their emotional openness as a weapon. When they discover that their protective behaviors don't automatically end relationships, they become more willing to experiment with keeping doors open longer, because the cost of vulnerability finally feels manageable. The doors that avoidants close aren't really about keeping love out. They're about controlling how love gets in, because uncontrolled love, in their experience, has always led to pain. When they feel safe enough to leave those doors unlocked, even partially, real intimacy becomes possible, because they're finally willing to risk being hurt for the possibility of being truly known. Have you ever watched an avoidant partner suddenly shut down just when things were getting good between you? Have you found yourself confused by their hot and cold patterns, wondering if you did something wrong? Share in the comments what it's been like to love someone who seems to fear the very intimacy they crave. If this helped you understand that their door closing isn't about rejecting you, but about protecting themselves from what love has meant to them in the past, like this video and subscribe for more insights into the complex world of avoidant attachment and how love can feel like both salvation and threat.